Hello guys, Arlo with you. Today we have a story about paramedics and their superstitions. So, prepare something tasty, grab a drink, and let's get started. Paramedics are incredibly superstitious. It's surprising how often people argue with me about this. Oh, definitely not. They're too logical, too smart, too calm under pressure to believe in something as irrational as superstitions. Some even argue for an absurdly long time, as if I wouldn't know better. Me, an EMT, with 4 generations of emergency medical professionals in my family. Both my parents spent decades as paramedics, and a long list of other relatives work either in hospitals or ambulances. Yet people still doubt me. Interestingly, this skepticism never applies to medical emergencies. When it comes to life-or-death situations, they fully trust my expertise. No arguments when we're stepping into a hospital or watching an ambulance arrive. But superstition? That makes them uncomfortable. The thought that paramedics, who might one day save their life, believe in ghosts, worry about a full moon, or avoid black cats unnerves them. I get it. No one wants to rely on someone who takes such things seriously. So I usually let the topic drop. For the record, though, some paramedics do avoid shifts during a full moon. My parents shared plenty of EMS folklore when I was growing up, and never say the Q word during a shift. Expect a busy night on a full moon. Don't plan to read or sleep while on duty. You'll definitely get endless calls. Sleep with your boots on and your stethoscope ready. If you run out of supplies and don't restock, you'll desperately need them next time. To never dine in at a restaurant while on duty. You'll be called out before ordering. These weren't meant to scare us. They had plenty of other stories for that. We called them the little white coffin stories. Like Grimm's fairy tales, they were dark and sometimes grim, crafted to keep us safe by teaching us life-saving rules. Don't hang upside down on monkey bars. Don't jump between rocks at the park. No riding your bike out of the neighborhood alone. Stay far from school bus wheels. No hard candy until you're older.
Absolutely no gilis.
No bouncy balls from bubblegum machines. If we asked why, Mom would gently but firmly explain, I treated a child who did that. Then she'd add, and you know what happened? Their mom had to buy a little white coffin. Morbid? Definitely. But it worked. I didn't swallow bouncy balls or leave the neighborhood unsupervised. I survived those childhood dangers, and the little white coffin stories evolved as I grew older. As teens, the stories warned about wandering alone in dark cities, dangers in the woods, and the risks of street drugs. I'll never forget one night when I was in high school. Mom came home after a tough call, panicked, asking if I had friends pressuring me into partying or experimenting with drugs. Once I reassured her of my social unpopularity, she relaxed and shared her ordeal. I just spent an hour trying to resuscitate one of your classmates, she said. He thought it was just weed, but they're lacing it with awful stuff now. It took 5 rounds of compressions to get a pulse. The next Monday at school, I listened closely during attendance, wondering if a name would be missing. Once I earned my EMT certificate, my parents' stories got even more detailed. It felt like I was no longer just a daughter to protect but a peer to confide in. They wanted to prepare me for the worst I might encounter on the job. By then, I thought nothing could faze me. So when Mom mentioned a story she'd kept from me, worried it was too unsettling, I was caught off guard. She told me she'd withheld it because she didn't want me to be afraid of hospitals. But by then, I was older and she decided I was ready to hear it. Here's the story she told me. When my mom was a young paramedic, she worked for a hospital in the mountainous woods of northern New Jersey. Most people think of New Jersey as the bustling suburbs around New York City. And yes, the state is densely populated, but there are remote, dark areas where the trees seem to swallow the light. In those woods, far from the noise and safety of the city, you can't help but wonder, how much could be hidden out there? The hospital my mom worked for at the time was, and still is, relatively small. It only has 2 main buildings with emergency rooms, located close to suburban areas. However, its paramedics were responsible for providing the same level of rapid, high-quality care to the vast rural regions of northern New Jersey as they did closer to the hospitals. To extend their reach, the hospital would rent old, unused medical facilities as paramedic quarters. Much like hermit crabs finding new shells, they repurposed these abandoned spaces to station paramedics far from the central hospital buildings. This is how my mom ended up spending long, dark nights in a vacant mining hospital, accompanied only by her crewmates and the restless woods surrounding the small structure. The hospital, trying to save on costs, left most of the old facility untouched, maintaining only a small office area for the paramedics. Despite being well-equipped with cots, lazy boys, a microwave, a fridge, and a private bathroom, the bright lamps in the quarters couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that they were intruding in a space long abandoned, and perhaps better left that way. Yet the building was once again serving a purpose: aiding the community. Locals had reported that trespassers were breaking into the facility, so security guards were hired to patrol the premises and ensure the paramedics felt safe. By day, the guards roamed the building, keeping out curious explorers and potential squatters. Initially, they patrolled the entire structure at night as well, aiming to reassure the paramedics. But on the very first night, this plan was scrapped. The security guards, with the best of intentions, shone their flashlights directly into the paramedics' quarters, waking the exhausted crew. The response was immediate and colorful. Irritated paramedics unleashed a storm of expletives, making it clear they didn't want to be disturbed again. After that, the guards avoided the quarters during their rounds. They would patrol the perimeter in their cars and check the other parts of the building, but they left the medics undisturbed. Mom grew accustomed to the eerie quiet of the hospital's empty halls and the creaks and groans of its aging structure. At night, the glow of flashlights would drift through the windows of the old patient wards, just visible from her quarters. Although there was always a faint sense of unease, partly from worrying the guards might disrupt their rest again, it was oddly comforting to know someone was watching over them during those long, dark shifts. Emergency medicine can feel isolating, despite its reliance on teamwork. As my mom often described it, there was an unspoken expectation that paramedics should bear their burdens alone. They were responsible for controlling their scenes, keeping the ambulance spotless, and, above all, keeping their patients alive. It was an exhausting job, one that demanded every ounce of energy. During the quietest hours of the night, the building would settle into a fragile stillness, and the medics would steal short naps between calls. Boots at the ready, wrapped in heavy coats, they curled up on bunks or couches, bracing against the ever-present anxiety that came with being on duty. It was on one of these nights that my mom experienced something truly strange. She lay in her bunk, unable to sleep. Her partner's loud snoring didn't help, but what really kept her awake was the memory of their last call. A grim visit to a hoarder's house. Though they had spent as little time as possible inside, quickly moving the patient to the safety of the ambulance, the scene had left its mark. Mom couldn't shake the image of maggot-infested plates teetering on piles of newspapers, plastic lawn chairs, and clothing bags stacked as tall as she was. Trails of mouse droppings crisscrossed the floor, leading to and from these precarious towers of decay. It was the kind of detail she couldn't overlook, a quality that made her an exceptional paramedic but also made it harder to move on from vivid, disturbing calls. Resigned to a sleepless night, she slipped out of her bunk. Scrubbing off the lingering grime without taking a full shower seemed like her best bet. Maybe she'd read for a bit afterward, or maybe the small ritual of cleaning up would finally help her relax enough to sleep. She crept into the small bathroom, a single-seater equipped with the rare luxury of a shower stall, a feature that tempted her as she closed the door silently behind her. Turning the sink on, she silently thanked the heavens for the old building's still functional plumbing. Steam began to rise immediately, curling into the cool, dry air, and for a brief moment, she watched the swirling plumes. But she didn't let herself linger too long. As the mirror fogged, she rolled her sleeves up high, adjusted the temperature to avoid scalding, and dove into her improvised cleaning routine. The hot water and cheap hand soap had the exact effect she hoped for. As soon as the warmth touched her hands, she felt her body relax. She scrubbed her hands and forearms as if prepping for surgery, meticulously cleaning under every fingernail and working the soap into every crease. She lathered her arms all the way up to her elbows, awkwardly rinsing them under the narrow tap. The simple ritual began to wash away the lingering grime, both physical and mental, from the stressful night. Chasing the momentary sense of relief, she continued, washing her face, wetting her hair just enough to braid it tightly against her scalp, even pulling off her boots and socks to clean her feet and calves. Finally, satisfied, she stepped back and surveyed the small disaster zone she'd created. Discarded paper towels littered the floor around the already overflowing trash can. Small puddles of water reflected the bathroom's flickering light, pooling on the slick tiles. The sink itself was drenched, steam rising steadily from the hot water still flowing at full blast, leaving the mirror thickly fogged. She shut off the water. The sudden silence was jarring after the steady roar that had filled the tiny space. She dried herself off, pulled her boots back on, and opened the door to let the room air out as she cleaned up. Cold air rushed in as she began gathering the soggy paper towels, using them to mop up stray puddles before shoving them into the overflowing trash can. Compressing the mountain of towels, she tied off the bulging black garbage bag and gave it a sharp tug to remove it. The vacuum seal fought her efforts, requiring several awkward twists and yanks before she finally freed the bag with a triumphant pull. She stepped back, turning away from the garbage can, then froze, her heart leaping into her throat. In the fogged mirror, a figure stood behind her, its face obscured by the condensation, leaning over her shoulder. She spun around with a startled curse, fully expecting to see one of her crewmates. But no one was there. She stood in the empty bathroom, her pulse racing. Confusion quickly turned to irritation. Of course, this had to be one of her colleagues playing a prank. She was all too familiar with the brand of mischief that ran rampant in the EMS world: elaborate pranks, running gags, morbid jokes involving medical equipment. She'd been both victim and perpetrator in her time, and though she could appreciate the humor on most days, she wasn't in the mood tonight. Grabbing the garbage bag, she marched out of the bathroom, determined to catch the culprit. The main room was still and quiet. Her partner lay undisturbed, snoring loudly in the bunk where Mom had left her. Around the corner, the two men from the other unit were also bundled up under their blankets and coats, their steady breathing confirming they hadn't moved. The room's only motion came from the oscillating space heater, and the faint blue glow of the television screen revealed nothing but a blank signal. She stared at her crewmates, weighing the evidence. Waking them for anything short of an emergency was a guaranteed way to tempt fate, but someone deserved to answer for scaring her. Deciding her partner would be the first target, she took a step toward her bunkmate, ready to jab her awake. Then she froze. From the bathroom, she heard the sound of running water. She stiffened, a chill running through her. Hadn't she turned the water off? She was certain she had. She distinctly remembered shutting the faucet off. Heart pounding, she turned slowly, her eyes fixed on the open bathroom door. The faint sound of rushing water echoed in the stillness, taunting her. Mom dropped the garbage bag by the door to their quarters and cautiously returned to the bathroom. Sure enough, the hot water was gushing from the faucet, steam swirling thickly into the small room once again. Ha! Mom frowned at the running water, her earlier thoughts of a prank forgotten. She reached out and twisted the handles firmly, ensuring they were tightly closed. Satisfied, she returned to her bunk, now pleasantly drowsy. Sitting on the thin mattress, she tried to recall if she had absent-mindedly turned the sink back on and why. Perhaps it had been an unconscious impulse to wash her hands again after handling the garbage bag? Her train of thought was interrupted by a faint sound. A creak, soft enough not to wake the other paramedics, came from the direction of the bathroom. Then, unmistakably, the rush of running water filled the quiet space once more. Her heart raced as she leapt off the bunk and strode toward the bathroom, adrenaline erasing her earlier drowsiness. Reaching the door, she carefully peeked inside. Her breath caught as she saw the hot water handle turning on its own, twisting until the faucet was fully open. She froze, watching the water gush into the sink, steam rising once again. For a long moment, she stood there, staring, her mind racing for a logical explanation. But none came. Swallowing her fear, she stepped into the bathroom, trying to ignore the shadowy figure she glimpsed over her shoulder in the fogged mirror. She leaned forward and washed her hands one more time, as though it might steady her nerves. With deliberate care, she turned the faucet off, dried her hands, and used the paper towel to flip off the light before stepping out of the room. Back at her bunk, she sat down and stared at the open bathroom door. The unease clung to her, thick as the steam had been. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn crept into the quarters, her partner, Lauren, stirred and stretched. "Good morning," Lauren mumbled, swinging her legs off the bed. "Did you sleep?" Mom said nothing at first, her brow furrowed as she continued to stare at the bathroom. "Corinne," Lauren prompted, rubbing her eyes. Mom looked at her partner, distracted. "Yeah, a little, I think," Lauren grunted, rising to gather her things, but Mom's gaze remained fixed on the bathroom. Finally, she broke the silence. "Hey, Lauren." Lauren turned back, curious. Mom hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question on her mind. Eventually, she sighed and asked, "What's the deal with the plumbing here?" Ghost stories were not uncommon among emergency responders, but Mom was careful not to advertise her belief in them. While tales of hauntings were widespread among volunteer ambulance squads, Mom was wary of being labeled a paid volunteer, a derisive term some professional EMTs used for paid responders whose competence was questioned. The only person Mom confided in about the incident was Lauren. Although Lauren was skeptical, dismissing the idea of ghosts being able to manipulate objects, she didn't ridicule Mom for bringing it up. Plus, Lauren admitted to having unsettling dreams while staying in the old hospital, which she thought might have some psychological basis worth exploring. Still, Lauren slept soundly during their breaks, unbothered by dreams or ghostly concerns. Mom, however, struggled to rest after the bathroom incident. Most nights, she sat awake, watching the guards' flashlights bob through the distant ward and listening to Lauren's soft snores. She even searched online for explanations, reading about misbehaving faucets. The only relevant cases she found were in forums discussing paranormal activity, answers that only fueled her unease. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with her. With daytime errands piling up, she found herself too tired to lose sleep over ghost stories or faulty plumbing. She began to doze off between calls once more. One cold winter night, cocooned in blankets she'd brought from home, Mom finally fell into a deep sleep. After a long day spent trudging through errands in the bitter chill, her exhaustion overwhelmed her the moment her head hit the pillow. The night outside was quiet, the clear sky glittering with stars. As the hours crept by, the moon arced across the heavens, casting pale light over the empty hospital. Inside, the old building stirred. A swaying beam of light appeared in the window of the distant ward. Slowly, it moved through the rooms, weaving its way closer as the minutes ticked on, unnoticed by the sleeping paramedics. The flashlight eventually landed on the door to the medics' quarters. Its beam glanced across the sleeping forms of the paramedics, who remained undisturbed. It wandered lazily around the room, illuminating stray boots, books left open and face down to mark their place, and extra snacks taken from hospital break rooms scattered here and there. One of their radios chirped softly, too softly to wake any of the sleeping medics. Its volume had been turned down too low, an oversight that none of them would remedy as the flashlight beam briefly settled on the device. "Hey, look alive!" Mom stirred as an insistent whisper reached her ears, pulling her from sleep. Keeping her eyes closed, she clung to the last wisps of rest, assuming the voice was speaking to someone else. It must be one of the men talking to his partner, she thought. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Wake up!" It was so close, so clear. She jolted upright. Anger replaced fear as she sat up, ready to chew out whichever idiot had decided to wake her. But when her eyes scanned the room, the other 3 medics remained in their bunks, fast asleep. She looked around, confused, trying to make sense of what had woken her. Everything was still. Then the radio chirped. 52! The dispatcher's voice called softly. Mom's stomach turned. Rising from her bunk, She walked over to the radio and pressed the button. 52 here, she responded, as she roused Lauren, grabbed her things, and climbed into the ambulance. The moment replayed in her mind. She tried to convince herself that it was the dispatcher's voice that had pulled her from sleep. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the memory of the deep baritone whisper that had urged her awake. So unlike the gentle soprano voice now providing their call details. Not long after that night, the medic unit was relocated again. The hospital frequently acquired and sold properties, shuffling units to new locations as needed. Mom and the other medics stationed in the old mining hospital were reassigned to different teams across the county. Occasionally, they'd bump into each other and reminisce about their strange experiences in that building. One day, they reached out to the security guards who had patrolled the hospital during their time there. The guards had always been kind and kept an eye on the paramedics, especially after the initial misunderstanding about waking them during patrols. Over drinks at a bar not far from the old hospital, they laughed and swapped stories from their respective shifts. "Hey, by the way," Lauren said during a lull in conversation, "thanks for letting us sleep. It was reassuring to see you guys patrolling the rest of the building." The guards exchanged puzzled looks. "What are you talking about?" one of them asked. Lauren furrowed her brow. "Your patrols. How you didn't wake us up again but still checked the rest of the hospital." The younger guard shook his head. "Oh, we didn't do any more walkthroughs after that first night." The older guard leaned in to clarify. "Yeah, once we realized your unit was stationed in that wing, we just checked the outer doors and did a drive-by. Most nights, we didn't even go inside." Mom froze, her blood running cold. "We definitely saw you," she insisted. "Every night. There was a flashlight moving room to room, sweeping through the wards." Lauren nodded. "We didn't hear alarms, no signs of break-ins. So who else could it have been?" The guards' expressions darkened, the light-hearted mood shifting abruptly. Finally, the older guard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Oh, that," he said, his voice casual as he sipped his drink. "That's just the doctor." The younger guard suddenly stiffened, nervously picking at the label of his nearly empty beer bottle, tearing small bits of paper off it as if the motion could steady him. "What doctor?" Lauren pressed, irritation creeping into her voice. The older guard groaned, settling back into his chair with a weary sigh. He leaned his arm casually on the bar top, clearly ready to launch into a story. Back when that hospital was active way back, it mostly served the mine and, occasionally, the small surrounding town. It was the only hospital most of those folks ever saw, but it was too small and remote to pull a full staff from one of the bigger hospitals in Morris County. The people they did have worked constantly, every day, sometimes around the clock. Just a handful of nurses, a few housekeepers, and at least one doctor. The older guard paused to sip his beer while the younger one continued fidgeting nervously, avoiding eye contact. He wasn't the only doctor who worked there, as far as we know, but he might as well have been. That man practically ran the place. He lived next door to the hospital, but most nights that was still too far for him. They kept a cot ready for him in the sick bay so he could stay close. He treated those miners like they were his own kids. The older guard took another swig before continuing. Now, this was back in a time when people thought women should go home at night, rest their dainty feminine legs after their oh-so-grueling jobs, which, of course, they shouldn't have had in the first place. He cast a mock-accusatory look at Mom and Lauren, who snickered and rolled their eyes. So, at night, he'd send the nurses home and take over rounds himself. All he carried was an old flashlight. He'd shuffle through the halls in his slippers, checking charts and noting vitals by the glow of his lamp. The guard sighed, swirling the last bit of beer in his bottle. He died right there in the hospital in his cot, went quietly in his sleep. Some say a patient noticed first, woken by the absence of his hand on their wrist. Others think it was one of the nurses, realizing he wasn't there in the morning, waiting to hand over his reports. The group sat in respectful silence, quietly honoring the loss of a man so dedicated to his work. But the older guard eventually broke the quiet. He never clocked out. The younger guard looked away, clearly uncomfortable. We've been getting reports for years about break-ins with no alarms triggered. People see a flashlight bobbing through the halls and think it's a curious teenager. So they call the cops. Cops come, find nothing, and leave, scolding the caller for wasting their time. After enough reports, the property owners hired us to keep kids out. Only it's never been kids. It's always been him. The doctor. The younger guard finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. He tries to help. The paramedics, startled, turned their attention to him. You'll be patrolling after an alarm trip, he continued, and hear a voice behind you whisper, in the basement. You go down there and find a vagrant who's broken in and cut his hand on a window. Or you'll be walking a corridor, and he'll shove you in the chest to stop you, just as a ceiling tile crashes down right in front of you. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting between the two women. You'll even shine your flashlight toward the new medic quarters and hear him mutter, "Scoundrel!" He shrugged awkwardly. Whatever that means. The paramedics sat in stunned silence, processing the story. I mean, Mom's coworker John eventually said, breaking the quiet, "At least he's trying to help." Paramedics are incredibly superstitious. I knew that long before Mom told me this story, but I hadn't realized just how superstitious they could be. When she finished her tale, she studied me, her eyes carefully watching my reaction. At first, I laughed, assuming she was trying to haze me or initiate me in some way. I just started volunteering with the ambulance squad that had been part of our family for generations. It seemed like the kind of ritual I hadn't been warned about yet. Did you get to see the doctor again? I asked, eager for more of the story. No, Mom replied, shaking her head with unsettling seriousness. That building ended up being abandoned. But I wanted to tell you about him, so you won't be surprised on your first overnight shift. I crossed my arms, skeptical. I mean, I've already done overnight shifts. She gave me a look I knew all too well, the yeah, right look dripping with sarcasm. A real overnight shift. At a real squad building with its own ghosts. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to figure out what she was hinting at. What, like Mom? Maybe this was all just an elaborate way to remind me to respect the experience of older responders, especially those in our family, like my late grandmother. Nah, Mom said, waving her hand dismissively. My mom's not haunting the squad house, but someone is, and he'll be keeping an eye on you, so you'd better be on your best behavior. All right, Mom, I chuckled. I'll be good. That was the last I thought about Mom's story, or the doctor. As the evening deepened into night, my shift started off uneventful, just a few early calls, and I was lucky enough to catch a few hours of sleep. Ghosts weren't on my mind when the moonlight crept across the polished wooden floor of the room I was dozing in. But I woke suddenly in the early hours, roused by a faint squeak, like work boots sliding across the floorboards. As I stirred, drifting back to consciousness, I heard a voice, a gruff male voice close to my ear. Hey, it barked. Come on, up. My eyes flew open, and I shot upright in bed, heart racing. My first thought was that I'd slept through a call, and a senior squad member had come to chew me out. But the room was empty. I sat there for a moment, my breathing heavy, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the next room, my partner snored loudly, the only other sound in the otherwise silent, deserted building. Just as I was about to lie back down, the tones crackled from a mobile radio in the other room. Too quiet, almost like an afterthought. We had a call. I got up, roused my partner, and laced up my boots. As we raced toward the emergency, my mind kept returning to the voice I'd heard. I've had a few years to think about that night. The more I reflect on it, the clearer the answer becomes. Paramedics are superstitious. What an interesting story. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe, write comments, and like. You can also check out other scary stories on the channel. See you soon.